built in the context of the Washington Treaty, not the London Naval Treaties, although they would be being constructed while the London Naval Treaty was being sorted out. Northampton Class heavy cruisers, or Northampton Class scout cruisers, or Northampton Class light cruisers. Because to say these ships are credible cruisers when they're first designed for the role they're envisaged, but then, thanks to the context confusion, become ships which do not fit up to the role required of their designation, is to put it mildly. The Northampton class are a class which have a problem. That problem is that they are conceived by a navy thinking one thing, with politicians saying something similar. They are built by a navy thinking something else, and politicians saying something completely different. And they're commissioned into a navy which is onto a third thing. And with politicians who are now so hopelessly divided, no one knows what they really want. So, here is my problem. If I'm evaluating this class as heavy cruisers, well, they're built to 9,000 tons, they carry 9 8-inch guns, and they have barely any armour. And when I say barely any armour, I mean barely any armour. At which point, and I can predict exactly who, will come up and go, but Dr. Clarke, you always used to say top trumps isn't the way to go. It isn't the way to go. But you do have standards of what you're looking at. And as I've been through the whole way through, the heavy cruisers are not heavy cruisers. They're all light cruisers. And even if I was going to evaluate the Northampton class compared to their counterpart light cruisers or large light cruisers, i.e. the counties or various other things, they wouldn't fit there as a fighting cruiser because they're not supposed to be a fighting cruiser. These are scouting cruisers. Yes, they're called a light cruiser when they're first being developed, but that's because the US Navy is the US Navy. They have all sorts of weird designations for things, and they're going to call things light cruisers because, broadly speaking, let's be honest, a scout cruiser can fit in just about with a light cruiser. And in a light cruiser category, a scout cruiser won't look too bad. It'll look fast and it'll look low on the armour, which is fine. You can get away with that in the light cruiser category. In the heavy cruiser category, it makes you look like a bazinka dink. So this is the problem. This is the problem with the entire treaty series, whether they are British, American, or Italian, or German even. The heavy, especially the Japanese, the heavy cruisers, unless you are completely lying about your figures, are nowhere near the displacement of what a heavy cruiser should be to have the title heavy cruiser when you compare what the equivalents would have been in the pre-World War I period, and without the artificial limitation the treaties probably would have been. So they're not heavy cruisers, and this is why, again, I'd like the French, because they go with cruiser de premier class and cruiser de secondary class, basically. You know, the first class and second class cruisers. That makes sense. That allows you to be honest. They are cruisers. Yes, they will do the cruiser role. But one is a first class fighting cruiser, one is a second class presence and task group fighting cruiser. One is something which can confidently engage enemy surface raiders on its own. Even a capital ship, theoretically, if you go back to the relative period of the armored cruiser, large armored cruisers, yes, a battle cruiser is designed to fight them, and the cost difference between the first battle cruisers and later battle cruisers changes that. But the first battle cruisers could be used instead of the large armor cruisers for the convoy escort. You could buy enough at that price to do the heavy convoy work. In which case, if you were a battle cruiser showing up and there was already a battle cruiser with a convoy, ouch, you'd run and go away. But if you're a battle cruiser and you show up and there's sitting there, yes, it's got some torpedoes originally. Yes, it has 9 8-inch guns. But It alone is not going to be enough to really scare you off. It can do damage. It can do damage, and that's remember the point of the heavy cruisers. But that's the point of the heavy cruisers. They can do damage. A county class with its 4 inches of armor has no chance, but you know, it has some actual armor. These ships don't have that. They are designed everything around making them as fast as possible for their design. Thankfully, they go for a far more efficient gun layout and gun design than the previous Pensacola class, which is why I have a lot more affinity and affection for these than I do the Pensacolas, because let's be honest, they are 9 guns in 3 triple turrets, which means they save a whole turret's worth of mechanism, a whole turret's worth of equipment. Yes, they drop a gun, they go from 10 to 9, but it's a lot less complicated when you have all turrets the same. Admittedly, they're all large, roomy turrets, which are only designed to fight the enemy at long range, because again, it's a scouting cruiser. It's not supposed to be getting so close to the enemy that it's actually going to have to fight a firefight at medium and short range, because it's a scouting light cruiser. That is what it's designed as, a scouting light cruiser. It's the London Naval Treaty which turns it into a heavy cruiser, which means if I compare it against the standard for what a heavy cruiser should be, and I have to admit the standard for what a heavy cruiser should be when I am going through these tends to be Wichita. Yeah, I said it, I admit it. The standard I use of a comparison baseline, if I'm comparing heavy cruisers for this period, are to an extent the county class and Wichita. Those are what I'm looking at and comparing people with. That's where I'm sort of going, what kind of belt armor? What kind of heavy cruiser are you? Which immediately puts these sort of ships in a bind, because they are never going to compete against them on what kind of heavy cruiser they are, because they're not even designed to be a fighting light cruiser like the counties are. They're certainly not designed to have a 6.4 inch belt armor. The fact that they actually are slower than Wichita will leave to one side. They are not designed to fight other cruisers. Apart from in the direst of circumstances, that's when they're supposed to fight. If they are fighting other ships, they are using their guns to either herd them towards the battle fleet or to fire at them in order to get away. They are scout ships. You can say they're part of a program which is conceived to work with the Lexington class carriers, in that you would have had these, along with probably Salt Lake City and Pensacola, of the Pensacola class, being engaged, possibly even the Portland class, the 2 vessels of that. So you've got 10 cruisers, you've got roughly 2 carriers, but you've probably got a third at some point, and theoretically you're able to form 3 task groups, each of 3 cruisers and carrier. And that's a good scouting force. That's a good reconnaissance force for the distances of the Pacific, for the operations of the Pacific. And they have enough firepower to deter any likely threats which might catch them, or they've got the aircraft out scouting. They've got their own scout aircraft on. They can do the operations they are being conceived for as part of the scouting fleet. Okay? The scouting fleet. They are not being conceived for being part of the battle fleet. Unfortunately, politics, changes in admirals, changes in theory of operation, changes in ideology in some respects in terms of how you conduct a Pacific war will mean that ships which are built as scouting cruisers, which are designated light cruisers and their construction, and which, thanks to treaty and due to having 8-inch guns, are turned into heavy cruisers, find themselves being compared to ships they were never supposed to be compared to. And the fact that 50% of them survived World War II is a testament to the qualities of speed, but also the qualities of their crews. These ships also have another advantage which makes them incredibly useful ships. They are designed to be divisional and fleet flagships. Let's restate this. Three are designed to be divisional flagships and accommodate the needs of a divisional staff or a squadron staff, that level. Three are designed to be fleet flagships with an admiral staff aboard. Now, that again gives us an idea. Was the US Navy at that point even then considering for its scouting groups, okay, where will the admiral sit? On one of the cruisers. The carrier will be operating and might have another admiral aboard, probably the second in command. The task group commander will be sitting on one of these cruisers. The task force commander will be sitting on one of those cruisers, probably also acting as, with his carrier admiral acting as his task group commander. And so you'd have six admirals going out the force, three on cruisers, the three senior ones, three on the carriers. And, this is how you have the force. You have a force of 9 cruisers, of 3 carriers, of attendant destroyers going out, scouting ahead of the battle group, scouting ahead of the battle fleet, finding and fixing the enemy. Leapfrogging along as those various seaplane tenders fan out to various small islands and inlets with enough marines aboard and enough parts, etc., to support and set up a seaplane base, which sends out patrol aircraft far and wide, increasing the reconnaissance and the information gathering of your force. It all sounds perfectly logical, doesn't it? They're supposed to be able to move fast, maneuver faster. That's their whole point. There's also the fact that you can tell they are built when they are built. You can also tell which people were in charge of them. Because here is the point. They are designed during the Washington Treaty period, where there is no total displacement limit, cumulative displacement limit, on cruisers. So there is no logical reason to reduce them down to 9,000 tons, other than to ensure they are completely and truly under 10,000 ton limit. But if you think about it, what could you have done with the extra 800 tons? Or 950 long tons? But they are good ships. Power came from 8 White Forster boilers supplying 4 Parsons turbines to drive 4 screws of 107,000 horsepower. Top speed 32.5 knots. Complement 1100 in ordinary as commissioned ships. As flagships, they could carry a lot more. Armament, as built, Northampton. 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns in 3 triple turrets. 4 5-inch 25 caliber guns in 4 single mounts. 2 3-pounder 47mm 1.9-inch saluting guns, and 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. By 1945, things have changed a little. Just a tad. There's now 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns in 3 triple turrets. There's 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns in 8 single mounts. I know I've got 4 single mounts. I do apologize. It's my own bad writing. At least you know that that I write these up myself, don't you? If there's mistakes in them. 2 3-pounder 47mm saluting guns and 24 40mm both guns. Now, They're normally in 6 quadruple mounts. Normally in 6 quadruple mounts. But, interestingly enough, I've read 2 accounts which claim they're in 4 quadruple mounts, 4 quads, and 4 twins. Most sources seem to agree on the 6 quads, so I leave it as the 6 quads. But there is a chance that that some of them were slightly variants, or there was a transition period where they might have had 4 twins and then they changed down to two more quads. I don't know. It's like in terms of aircraft, they could carry quite a lot. And as you can see, they have extensive aircraft facilities here. If we go back again, I can list it straight off. 4 seaplanes supported by 2 midship catapults and a seaplane hangar. Now, of course, I've mentioned the armour, so let's consider the armour. Belt 3.7 inch to 1 inch thick. Please look for portholes, that will tell you where the belt is. There are portholes, doesn't tend to be a solid belt. Barbettes 1.5 inch. Turrets between 2.5 inch and 0.75 inch. Conning tower 1.25 inch. Now, if we consider the turrets which will be fitted to Wichita, their armour is 8 inches thick. Again, the more and more you look at these ships, the more and more you realise that these ships are built for reconnaissance, for scouting, for the scouting force, for the high-speed, long-range, distance operations they are supposed to do as part of that battle plan. So, as scout cruisers, good, you make sense. As heavy cruisers, you don't make sense. Now, even the New Orleans class, 1.5 inch to 8 inches of armor on their turrets, and a 3 to 5 inch belt. Go back earlier, Portland class. They're a 3.25 to 5 inch belt. Notice deck armor's not mentioned here. Barbettes, 1.5 inches on both them and the Portland class. I do love it on the fact that, it gets actually worse to an extent, but on the Portlands, because they know now these are going to be heavy cruisers, because they know what they're looking at, because they're laid down in 1930, which means you know what's coming in terms of London Treaty, and yet the turrets are 1.5 inches to 2.5 inches thick armor. So still, I wouldn't say they're definitely still long range engagements in terms of their protection. Definitely still long range engagements. But that's what happens. Now, Northampton starts off life as CL-26. Please note that CL-26, light cruiser 26. She becomes CA-26, heavy cruiser 26. Magically, by the power of the pen, no changes in design, no changes in construction, no massive refit and rebuild, she turns from light cruiser to heavy cruiser. And as we've been over before, she's not just a light cruiser, she's a scout role orientated light cruiser. She goes from the lightest of large light cruiser you can get to having to theoretically be a heavy cruiser. She's a good ship. She achieves, in her short career, a lot. She is of course sunk at the Battle of Tassafaronga, and I would like to point out that when she is sunk at the Battle of Tassafaronga, whilst you can suggest that her construction and design does put her in a weak spot if she is hit by a torpedo, the fact that she's hit by a torpedo is not the fault of this ship. It's the fault of the officers who are not zigzagging. Okay? I know you can say those officers were presuming that the Japanese did not have torpedoes with the range to come from their destroyers. That they did. I would agree with that. However, and I would add this one, they also didn't know whether there was a Japanese submarine in the region. And this is it's not something which is not rocket science. Other US Navy officers have been considered. The British, who are the American allies, would have been zigzagging because they always presume there's an enemy submarine nearby. This is the point. Always assume there's an enemy sub nearby unless you are 100% certain. I have drained all the water because you lose very little from presuming a submarine's nearby. You gain a lot. You gain a lot. She still managed to achieve 6 battle stars, though, in her short World War II career. Because if you think about it, World War II starts when it starts for the Americans in 1941, December 1941. And, well, she is lost at the Battle of Trafalgar in, well, let's put it this way: she's lost in December 1942, so she doesn't make a full year of war. That's like 6 days shy of a full year. She was at sea with the Enterprise, Yorktown Class carrier, at the beginning of World War II when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. She was doing the job she was supposed to be doing. This is the other thing we've discussed: fast carrier escort, which again makes sense if you're designing her as they were designed. If your ship and your carriers are going to be at the periphery, not the focus of the fight. If they're going to be the focus of the fight, you then have to design your ship slightly differently. Because something at the periphery of the fight can bang, bang, bang and withdraw. Something which is a focus, there's no chance of withdrawing. The enemy are going to be after you. So the whole point of you being withdrawing, well, you're withdrawing as quickly as you can on the battleships. In the nicest way, if you're having to withdraw that fast, why do you have not something a lot heavier with you to protect you? Because you might need something to sacrifice itself to buy you time to get away. Destroyers will try, but as we all know with HMS Glorious, they will be brave. Successful, no. She's built by Bethlehem Steel, which was one of the oldest companies in the United States, founded in 1857. They kept going on and kept building ships. They are defunct as of 2003. They stopped building ships, I think, in the 1990s. They were a good historic company which the US Navy could rely on for building ships of good quality. And, they manufactured steel for the George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Peace Bridge, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, Alcatraz, the Empire State Building, Madison Square Garden, Merchandise Mart, One Chase Manhattan Plaza, the Rockefeller Center, Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the Bonneville Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, the Hoover Dam, and the San Francisco Municipal Railway. They also fabricated the largest electric generator shaft in the world, which was produced for General Electric in the 1950s. And the steel of apparently something called the Wonder Wheel in Coney Island, which I've never seen. It's apparently a Ferris wheel. you know. And of course, hundreds of ships. At one point, their shipbuilding corporation had 7 shipyards. So this is a really strong company to go, we need to build ships. And you're going to see that throughout this cruiser construction. The US Navy goes to some very good companies to build these cruisers. So again, they are going to be well built. And they are. And I love their lines. These do not are not going to get the complaint from me that Pensacola's got of looking unbalanced, because honestly, there was partially the gun arrangement, also the way they pushed the guns as forward and various other things they can, everything to try and get 10 guns out of it. When let's be honest, 9 guns in 3 triple turrets is 90% of the firing with 75% of the structural issues. You can condense and armor those spaces far better. It's a far more efficient use of space. Provides you a far better quality ship overall. Now, Chester, she's a pretty ship. Again, starts off as light cruiser number 27, then becomes heavy cruiser number 27. And again, ordered in 1924. These ships are all ordered in 1924. This is the point I made at the beginning, but I'm going to make it again and again. They are ordered under a navy with one plan and a government with a plan not too dissimilar, different but not too dissimilar. They are constructed under a navy with a different plan and a government with a plan which is completely weird. And they are into service, commissioned into a navy with a third plan, and the government which has about this many plans. Okay, so they start off like this, move to like this, and then you got this. Which is a bit confusing, I know. But that's the point. It's confusion. Which is why these ships are quite so easy to malign, but also don't deserve it. But at the same point, the critique of the ships, it might not be fair, but the critique of the government should be fair. Because if you've got to go and set up a scenario that you are openly building ships that no longer fit the roles you're going to give them, then you need to have the confidence in government as a navy to be able to go to them and go, we need to cancel these ships and order a different design. But they don't. You could say it's the same disease which still affects navies to this day. It's a disease which creeps in post World War One. I'm not sure where it comes from, but at some point post World War One, in the vast majority of democracies, in fact all of them, at some point, a disease has crept in where navies can no longer go to governments and go, the design we're building doesn't fit the needs anymore. We'd like to change the design. We can keep the existing the ships that are already finished. We can use them, but we don't want to build any more. Chester is special, and her claim to fame is she's one of the first ships fitted with the CXM radar. She also survives World War II. Now, the CXM radar is a pretty cool system because, for me, it illustrates more than anything the fact that the US Navy are working and the US forces are working on radar for quite a while. Radar is often depicted as being some sort of British only history. It isn't. The British do manage to get there first, but you can argue there are reasons for the British getting there first. One, there's the way the Royal Air Force is run, for want of a better phrase. Two, there's the fact the way the Royal Navy is run in this period. And three, there's the geostrategic position of Britain. And the geostrategic position of Britain is we may be the largest navy in the world. We may be one of the two largest navies in the world on paper, but we know Congress is not building up to the letter strength, so we're still technically the largest. But we have a problem the Americans don't have. The Americans, for them, their nation divides their threats. You're either coming across the Atlantic Ocean, in which case they have that depth, or cross the Pacific. But if you're the British, you're not doing that. For the British, if you're dealing with your threats, they're either coming across the North Sea, which is the latest threat which comes on in prior to World War II. Let's be honest, Hitler's the one that gets the power latest, and Japan and the Royal Navy have been pointing guns at each other for over a decade by the time Hitler gets to power in various interesting incidents. Italy, fascist dictatorship, sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean. Okay, yes, on paper, Britain has the French as allies, and we are as close and as lockstep as you can imagine two allies to be at this point. But the Mediterranean is also a critical sphere for getting to where else the British need to go. The British need to go to the Far East. And remember, the British, if they're going to the Far East, are not going across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, and across the Pacific. They're not doing what America does. Why? Because that wouldn't protect their territories, for starters, which are all the other way around. But for the secondary, they have bases all the way around. It's far more efficient to go the other way. For them, the quick route to the Far East is through the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, straight to Singapore, and up. That's the route for the British. So that's where the Italians are. And then if they get to Singapore and fighting the Far East, they're now fighting on the opposite side of the world from their industrial and infrastructure mega hub, from the core of their industry, where all their resources and everything will come from. Anything which reduces casualties, anything which reduces damage and makes things easier to survive is going to be essential. Because of that idea of you always fight wars with what you have, and you fight battles with what you have available. Not what you want and not what you wish. Louisville is another interesting ship. She is, again, a survivor of World War II. She is one of the ones which reaches the limit of the cost, going up to $11,100,000. Ordered in 1924, awarded in 1927, but there is a supplementary contract issued in June 1927. So she's one of the ships which is modified to be basically a flagship. She was actually sponsored by Miss Jane B. Kennedy. And has a very interesting career. Really interesting career. She takes part in Laeti Gulf. She takes part in all sorts of interesting operations. Unfortunately, she misses out on some others, but she has a very interesting pre-World War II career, especially. She was the school ship for the anti-aircraft gun training for about a year, and would carry on flirting with being that school ship role for most of her pre-World War II career, which explains why her AA guns tend to be fairly good. Because she gets a lot of experience training the AA gun crews and therefore practicing for her own gun crews, which feeds into generations and generations of her personnel. She also, in 1937, collided with the American halibut fishing boat Alton in the harbor of Kentucky in the territory of Alaska. There was no loss of life thanks to the prompt action of her crew, and of that the United States Coast Guard cutter CGC Cyan. She took part in a Pacific cruise in 1938. And while in Sydney, again, Louisville was involved in another rescue. This time, a number of passengers from a sightseeing ferry boat which had capsized and sank. Because the passengers crowded the top deck, of the rail to wave the cruiser off. Unfortunately, on this occasion, 19 other passengers died. She took part in the fleet exercise in the Caribbean in the winter of 1939. And she travelled through the U-boat infested waters with the American flag spotlighted as a neutral ship after war began to go to South Africa, where she received $148 million in dollars in gold for a deposit in the USA. So she took gold for the British under a flag of neutrality from Simonstown, South Africa, to the USA, New York. She was built in Puget Sound Naval Yard, which is another cool place. It's one of those shipyards you hear less about, but it's pretty darn useful. And it's, how do I put this? It's certainly something that needs to be considered. It's still technically active, still technically used, and has 6 large dry docks and 2, potentially, 2 really shipbuilding ways. They have built Louisville. They would build an Astoria, which is New Orleans class. They built a Farragut class, Warden, Mahan. It's a couple of Mahan classes, Cushing and Perkins. A couple of Bagley classes, Patterson and Jarvis. Benham class, Wilson. Benson class, Charles F. Hughes. Glaze class, Monson. And 8 Fletcher class. Halford, Lutz, Huiff, Killen, Hart, Metcalf, Shields, and Wiley. Plus 8 Evetts class destroyers. It really is an important and really rather interesting yard. And yeah. But it's not really built up that much. And I would have to say, one of the things I find interesting about its history is when I was looking at its construction, the critical thing that comes through is boat and thinking about morale issues, because I realized very quickly the construction of these boats are essential and these smaller ships are essential for naval operations. But they don't give the shipyards a lot of pride. Whereas constructing the big ships give you a lot of pride. Because let's be honest, the boats don't appear. It doesn't appear on paper. Boat built by Puget Sound Naval Shipyard has helped with this and this operation. Won't appear in newspapers. However, USS Louisville saves X and X crew of halibut a fishing vessel built in Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Yeah, that appears in the papers. Good for morale. USS Chicago. Chicago. Right then, guess what she starts out as? Yes, you're not mistaken. CL-29, and then becomes CA-29 by the magic of a pen. Now, she actually managed to get quite damaged. She has a collision with British freighter, the Silver Palm, in 1933, and almost as an Eskimo. In fact, pretty much a large chunk of the bow forward of A turret is severely damaged. She gets lost in the Battle of Rhode Island in 1943. She's also another one with a supplementary contract, and is sponsored by Miss E. Britain when she's launched. Her pre-World War II career, well, thanks to getting bashed into by Silver Palm, is slightly less expansive than some of her other sisters, because she needs to be rebuilt. But she does serve as the flagship of Commander Cruiser's scouting force from pretty much 1931 till almost 1940. She operates with that force for most of the 9 years of her pre-World War II career, when she's not being repaired. She's also one of 6 ships which, as mentioned earlier, received the CXAM radar in 1940, produced by I think it's the Radio Corporation of America. Yeah, I love the fact that some people call it the RCA Corporation. It's literally called the Radio Corporation of America. So you're saying the Radio Corporation of America Corporation when you say the RCA Corporation. I can understand the necessary of putting it in and the context, but it does also seem slightly linguistically redundant. She takes part in many of the fleet exercises, again, when she's not being repaired. And she cruises to Australia prior to World War II. So in sort of 1940, from September 1940, when she reaches Pearl Harbor, she's doing all sorts of operations and what you would call presence missions, sailing around the ocean, giving a good account of herself, basically going, "Hello, I'm here. Don't I look big and impressive?" And that is something you can say about Northamptons. They do a nice line in looking big and impressive. She gets bashed up a bit in wartime, and unfortunately gets lost in Rennell Island. She's built at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, which is... I'm going to expand because I want you to be able to look at that big picture at the top. Mare Island was the first US Navy base established on the Pacific coast. It's 25 miles northeast of San Francisco in Vallejo, California. The Napa River goes through it and the Mare Island Strait and separates the Peninsula Shipyard from the main port city of Vallejo. It's become pretty much the premier US West Coast submarine port and also served as a controlling force in the San Francisco Bay Area shipbuilding efforts during World War II. It was really critical to US efforts in World War II. Its 4 docks were completed between 1891 and 1942, with dock number 1 made of concrete and granite, being 160 meters long, 37 meters wide, and with a depth of 10.9 meters, and completed in 1891. This contrasts with the dock number 3, which is probably the largest dock they have, which is made of concrete, 211.3 meters long, 35 meters wide, and 10.9 meters deep. And that was completed in 1940. With 8 shipbuilding ways, let's see if you can figure out which one this cruiser was built on. Shipway 1, which is 33.12 meters in width and 210 meters long. Shipbuilding way 2, 27 meters width, 121 meters long. Shipbuilding way number 3, 28 meters in width, 149 meters long. Shipbuilding way number 4, 29 meters in width and 140 meters in length. And the same goes for 5 to 8 as the same as number 4. And again, if we go back to Northampton Class, they are 177 meters long, 180 at the waterline, 180 meters overall, 20.14 meters in beam. So, where do we think in Mare Island the lovely USS Chicago is built? Where is Chicago built? Do we think in Shipbuilding Way number 1, Shipbuilding Way number 2, Shipbuilding Way number 3? Well, you can sort of work it out because being 182 meters overall pretty much rules out every single one barring Shipbuilding Way number 1, which is good because that's the space she needed to be constructed. But also tells you something, that even a yard as big as Mare Island and Mare Island Naval Shipyard, which has on the face of it all these big shipbuilding ways, building what is quite a comparatively narrow cruiser, still only has one shipbuilding way which can take this cruiser and construct it. Infrastructure. It runs everything. Or rather, everything runs on it. USS Houston. Houston. Sunk at the Battle of Sunda Strait in 1st of March 1942, along with HMAS Perth. Originally CL-30, becomes CA-30. Built by Newport News, so that's going to be an interesting discussion when that actually comes up next. During the interwar period, well, she visited her namesake city, joined the fleet at Hampton Roads after commissioning, and then departed for the Pacific in January 1931, stopping at the Panama Canal and the Hawaiian Islands, arriving in Manila on the 22nd of February. She was flagship of the Asiatic Fleet upon arrival, and would retain that role for much of the time again in the interwar period. She participated in continuing training operations in the Far East, and when war broke out between China and Japan in 1931, she was one of the first vessels to Shanghai to protect American interests. She landed Marine and Navy platoons to try and help stabilize the air situation in the area. And she was there, with the exception of a quick goodwill cruise to the Philippines and one to March, until she was relieved by Augusta, her sister, in 1933. November 1933. From that point on, she then sailed to join the scouting force and participated in all fleet problems prior to World War II. She also was a vessel used to transport President Franklin Roosevelt in 1934. They took him through the Caribbean to Portland, Oregon, by way of Hawaii. Houston also carried the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Henry L. Roosevelt, on a tour of Hawaiian Islands in 1935. So Houston is absolutely critical to the American development and assessment of the Hawaiian Islands and of the Pacific, because she's a vessel which literally takes people around to do a Mark 1 eyeball review of the scenario and go and see. And so she's critical to the shaping of American doctrine in the Pacific. Despite the fact that the more the doctrine takes shape, the less and less, let's be honest, this class fits with that doctrine. Because yes, fast escort for carriers, still a role. Scouting force, still theoretically should be there, but the ships are now expected to be fighting a bit more than they are, which is why you get the changes in design you do. Now, considering the dramatic change, especially once you get the Baltimore class come in and other proper heavy cruisers come in, you start to understand what the big difference is and how how disparate the American ideas of war in the early 1920s, when these ships are being conceived, are from the early 1930s, when they're entering service and when other ships are being ordered. Newport News shipbuilding. One of the most critical infrastructure hubs in the world to this day. Without them, the US Navy would not be able to build pretty much any of their carriers at this precise moment. If we consider currently, as we talk about it, Newport News is you know, is building the Ford class. Enterprise and Doris Miller are under construction. The entirety of the Nimitz class are there. It's just I don't know. You cannot overstate how important this shipyard is. Also, how cool the railway that runs around is. Please, again, I will admit I am a bit of a railway buff, and I do love the trains. But a vast number of the Essex class aircraft carriers, including Essex herself, are built there. The Virginia class nuclear cruisers are built at Newport News. The second nuclear submarine, I think, and the first nuclear powered submarine of the US, built by that yard, Shark, is built there in 1960. USS Texas was built there, the only surviving dreadnought battleship. All the Nimitz class have been built at that yard. Enterprise was built at that yard. Without this yard, the modern US Navy would not exist. So it's kind of interesting that they end up building Houston and Augusta, the last two of the Northampton Class cruisers. Again, it's trusting a really proven yard to do the construction. But also, it's worth noticing that Houston and Augusta are ever so slightly different to their colleagues. They're ever so slightly different. They do have ever so slightly thicker, I would argue, at certain points, armor. Why do I say this? Because when you look at some of their turret designs and turret outlines, you start to think that Houston and Augusta, whilst they theoretically had the same between 19 and 64 mil, that's between 3/4 and 2.5 inches thick turret armor, they seem to have more areas covered by that. It might be just the drawings or designs, but it was really kind of interesting when I was looking through it. Now, Augusta, she's a special ship. She is pretty much a presidential flagship, and that is a lot of her history. Interwar, wartime, whenever a president needs to be moved around, Augusta seems to turn up. She's also a critical flagship for various other operations. She fulfills the flagship criteria of these ships to a T. She's also one of the critical ships, as mentioned earlier, on the China station, the Asiatic Squadron. She does a lot of work with them. And even visits Tsingtao in July 1938. While she's doing her operations off Shanghai. She is refitted in 1940 at Mare Island Navy Yard. And this is after she'd been serving as flagship, taking over from her sister on the Asiatic flagship. And it's during this refit that her 4 additional 5-inch guns were mounted on top of the aircraft hangar. Splinter protection was fitted for the 5-inch guns on the hangar and on the boat deck. Interim 3-inch 76mm anti-aircraft guns are installed. These are installed until there can be a proficient 1-for-1 replacement with the 1.1-inch guns. Mark 19 directors are installed for the 5-inch guns. And a pedestal is fitted atop the foremast to receive the CXM radar antennae when it became available. So she's set up to receive the CXM radar. She, of course, gets the CXM 1 radar, the next generation, the next 14 sets. So her sisters received some of the first 6 sets. There's the first set, then there's the 6 sets, and then there's a batch of 14 sets. She's one of the ships that receives the 14 sets. Why do American heavy cruisers receive their radars so quickly? Quite simple. It's not just a scouting force role or their fast carrier role. They are ships which the US Navy can rely on for A, producing enough electrical power to support these radars, and B, having the space and top weight available to accommodate these radars, with some modifications, and C, are going to be able to keep pace with the task groups when they're moving around. This is a very useful thing for them. Again, doesn't make them a heavy cruiser, but it does make them a very useful ship. She was chosen to serve as President's flagship as early as mid-June 1941. And pretty much her anti-aircraft armament and other stuff are included as part of her critical role because these weapons are considered incident to possible future presidential use and other urgent work. However, as in unexpected, an unusual thing with the American bureaus, this caused a small war between the Bureau of Ships and the Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet. Bureau of Ships were not told about the President's plans, so they issued hold orders on Augusta at Navy Yard for extended repairs. And this held until Admiral King informed the Bureau of Ships that the alterations to heavy cruisers for possible use by the President were initiated by the Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet after conversations with the President, and were considered to be essential. I'm not quite sure whether Admiral King was using the presidential title as a mallet to hit the Bureau of Ships over the head with, or whether he was just mentioning the president while he hit them over the head with a mallet. Whatever happens, Augusta gets very quickly turned around. I mean, Bureau of Ships goes from, this is not an essential, we will put a hold on it, to, get this done now! Now! We're not sure who's upset with us, but it seems to be at least one person who's prepared to kill us. Admiral King, stay away. We have a cross of steel. This is a ship's cross. Protect us, O Lord, for Admiral King approaches. A little bit facetious, I know, but it's basically the interesting thing about Augusta's whole experience. The Battle of Sunda Strait. Well, this is part of the sort of the whole Java and Sumatra campaign, and it ends with the heavy cruiser sunk, the light cruiser sunk, and the destroyer sunk. The heavy cruiser is, of course, American, and it's not really a heavy cruiser, it's a scout cruiser. The light cruiser is HMS Perth, which is an Amphion class vessel, basically modified Leander, operated, and actually formerly HMS Amphion, operated by the Australian Navy. Interesting enough, belt roughly 3 inches, magazine 2 to 3.5 inches protection, deck 1.125 inches, and gun turret 1 inch of armor. You start to realize that, again, how light Houston's armoring is. They, of course, in terms of the Battle of Sunda Strait, they were trying to sort of evacuate their position in evacuate Tanjung Priok, and they're planning to head through the Sunda Strait to the south coast of Java. Waller was in de facto command. Waller, because of seniority, was the Australian officer in charge of Perth and made the decision. And so they were expecting to find only Australian corvettes on patrol. Instead, they ran into the Japanese invasion convoy bound for West Java. There was a very, very fierce fight. The Japanese troop transports were being escorted by the 5th Destroyer Flotilla, led by Rear Admiral Kenzaburo Hara, and the 7th Cruiser Division under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. The light cruiser, Notori, and the destroyers, Harakaze, Hatase, Asakizi, Fubuki, Hatsuyakaye, Shirakumo, Murakamo were closest to the convoy. And to the north were the heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, accompanied by the destroyer Shikami. There was also further north another pair of heavy cruisers and a Ryujo, and a seaplane tender, and some more destroyers. So, for some reason, two cruisers did not really have much of a chance, especially as the destroyer actually left and ended up leaving a long time after them and wasn't really part of the fight, but got sunk trying to evade the fight. Sensibly, because she'd realised if the two cruisers were being completely smashed around, then she had no chance. When the Allied ships first sighted a ship, they thought it was an Australian corvette, but instead, when challenged, they replied. The ship sighted replied with a lamp, which was the wrong color, and fired the 9 long lance torpedoes from about 3,000 yards, which is practically point blank range. Interesting enough, the Allied ships put up quite a fierce fight. They damaged 4 Japanese transports and a minesweeper. Mostly sunk by friendly torpedoes that missed their target, but that suggests how big a fight Perth and Houston were putting up, because the fact that the Japanese and ships were firing torpedoes quite so wildly they hit their own Allied ships. Yeah, that's the joy of a night fight, and when it's a hard fight. This included the Yurujo Maro, which was carrying Lieutenant General Imawara, who had to jump overboard. He was rescued by the crew of a small boat and taken ashore afterwards, but Unfortunately, both Waller and Houston's Captain Rook are killed. The survivors were picked up by Japanese vessels taken prisoner. 368 from Houston, 307 from Perth. They tried their best. Then we have the Battle of Rennell Island, and the Battle of Rennell Island is sort of interesting in that it's really the last major naval engagement between the USN and the IJN during the Guadalcanal campaign. And when I say sort of interesting, it's mainly an air attack. And what pretty much happens is the Imperial Japanese Navy and some of the Army aircraft decide they are going to absolutely smatter the Americans to try and make way for their ships to evacuate them from Guadalcanal. And they managed to do some severe damage, including to USS Chicago. Here is her being towed by Louisville. Yes, Louisville tries to get Chicago out of there. Tries to get her sister to safety. Unfortunately, they just keep hitting her. And despite fighter cap and various other things, she just keeps getting hit. And eventually, they have to order the ship to be abandoned. And she is sunk. She's been hit by... Well, let's count this up. Depending on accounts you read, most seem to go with 6 torpedoes. The reason I went let's count this up, is because my notes also had a little bracket 7 with a question mark. And one account I read suggests that 7 torpedoes hit her. But I think possibly, and that's based on the counts of torpedoes hitting their targets to an extent. We do know another torpedo did hit Wichita but didn't explode. So that comes from a Japanese source. 7 torpedoes hit the stricken cruiser. 3 in the first wave, 4 in later wave. The later wave got through by feinting towards the Enterprise, withdrawing the cap, of course, went to protect their carrier, and then dodging towards the stricken cruiser, which is trying to get through the water. Let's be honest, no cruiser is going to survive getting hit by that much firepower. No one. They're not designed for it. None of them designed for it. So, summary. And this is Augusta and Houston in Newport News. They're having a fun time. I'm sure they are. You know, look at them being built there, going, ooh, aren't we pretty? And this is her with all the various command staff she had on her, you know, presidents, the command, the various generals, admirals, prime ministers with their aides wandering on behind them going, what am I here for? Do you not have enough gold braid around you? I'm here for this, aren't I? So, as heavy cruisers, here is the question I would ask anyone before they start defining them as heavy cruisers. Would you want to be in a fight against any other heavy cruiser in this ship? If your answer is yes, why? Hawkins class? Possibly. But really, it's like the Pensacola class. But the Pensacola class have taken it to a weird extreme and produced a really strange design. This one has just produced a design which is actually very good for the concept in 1924 to 1926. It doesn't really fit with the fleet operations of 1927 to 1929. It has no relation to the fleet operations and plans and the political plans 1930 to 1932, and just gets worse as you go further on. As a scout cruiser, they are a very good design. As a ship, if you think about a scout cruiser, what would you not ask a scout cruiser to? Would you ask it to be doing a bombardment against a defended enemy coast, or anywhere where it wasn't actually going to be able to go maximum speed and just crack on with maneuvering? No, because a scout cruiser is even more like a battle cruiser than a battle cruiser. It's even more dependent on its safety is maneuver. Its safety is keeping the enemy at range. Its safety is never fighting for information. Its safety is having enough firepower to blast itself out of situations, not to get into them in the first place. That is this ship. It is designed in the Washington Treaty era, not the London Treaty era. If it had been designed in the Washington Treaty era, I have no doubt at all, these ships would have been 6-inch gun ships. Because if you're going to build a scout cruiser, light cruiser, in the London Naval Treaty era, you're going to go in for a 6-inch gun vessel, because you can achieve a better balance. When they're first being conceived, yes, 9,000 tons, you do not need to be going down on load, but you must remember you can build as many cruisers as you like. So it makes sense to have some cruisers which are engaged in a scouting role, and some cruisers which are probably going to be around the commerce protection and the fleet operation role. There is probably going to be a two-step force, and what is the US Navy lacking in the early 1920s? They're lacking the scout cruiser force, especially when they lose the battle cruisers. So they are constantly making up for those things, which is why these ships become flagships. So there is this going on. The US Navy is doing its best to deal with the scenarios it's facing. The trouble is, the scenarios it's facing are not what it was originally designed for. They're good scout cruisers. They're not good heavy cruisers. They're good for a navy and doctrine they were designed for. They're not good for the navy and doctrine they entered service with. And what they did in World War II was good service, but it was down to their crews and down to the professionalism and personnel aboard them. And there is also a reason that 50% of the class don't survive. And again, when I'm talking about the tribal class destroyers, you hear me talking about their numbers and going, well, they're lost because of the missions they're sent on. All right. Okay. So these ships aren't sent on particularly dangerous solo operations as a rule. No, they're often kept as part of the task groups. And there's almost a problem with that because these ships, flagships, they serve and they provide a lot of space for a flagship, but they'd almost have been better as part of the very fast mobile fleets that weren't hanging around doing bombardment operations and weren't sitting around, or which, when they were part of, they did really well in. Because again, mobility, scout cruiser, they can fulfill those roles. They weren't good at fulfilling what the US Navy, to an extent, was expecting from its heavy cruisers. And once you get to the Wichitas and later heavy cruisers, you see why. Because you now have a coherent heavy cruiser design coming out of the US Navy that fits what they want for their heavy cruisers. And you almost go, well, you're going to need to use this, still use these ships as scout cruisers. And of course, they don't have enough ships because you never have enough ships. So they have to use the scout cruisers as heavy cruisers. And that's where they run into their trouble. As good as ships as they are and as good a cruiser they are. And thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And yeah, I always finish these off with questions. And I'm going to finish off today with a question. Today's question is quite simple, really, but also quite interesting, I think. If you take the US Navy's doctrine of heavy cruisers as created by the Wichita class and Baltimore class and go back to the 1920s, what would the cruisers be that you would design? How would you change the Pensacola class? How would you change Northampton class? Would you change anything about them, or do you think they were fine as they were? I'd like to hear your points because, as I said, my view is they are designed as very good scout cruisers, and for the scouting force and the fast fleet operations which they are sort of originally designed for, they make sense. It's for when they become part of the battle fighting force that's when they get into trouble because they're not designed to sit and fight battles. They don't have the armor and stuff like that. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.